And it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer, really, standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host, and we're coming at you live like every Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. And if you're listening live, you can check the chat room out at podcastufo.com. We have another great show for you tonight. Alejandro Rojas from Open Minds is coming right up with the news. And after that, we have some guests. We have multiple guests. We have Peter Robbins, who's been on the show before, and someone I've been trying to get on the show or wanting to get on the show for a long time, Robert Salas. And it should be an interesting show. So, Alejandro, you there?
I'm here.
You know, before we get into the news, I want to talk to you about the conference I went to this weekend, the New England Conference down in Leominster, Massachusetts. There's two things, in my opinion, that I consider a mistake in your second year of any type of conference. And number one is, it's not such a good idea to take a $20 ticket and change it to a $60 ticket, so tripling a price. And secondly, having the same guests on. Before I get your opinion on that, I just want to say that I did meet up with a number of people that I haven't seen for a while. I also sat and talked. I'm going to give a little shout-out to Donna. I had a great time with her, a fan that listens to the show. It was a good time. Even though it was a very sparse crowd, I still had a good time there, and I'm still glad I went. And met up with Mark D'Antonio, who you just saw a couple of days ago, because he said he was on his way out there to you.
Yeah.
And so what do you think about that as far as the conference goes?
I agree with you. You know, there's a simple formula I always work with conferences is that, you know, the less expensive, the more people you're going to have. And what do you want? More people. And in the end, then you make more money. Also, you know, I really am not a big fan of the same old. At the UFO Congress, we try never to have the same people the next year. And we try to have new and different people out there. So there are a lot of people that you and I interview that have a lot of great information but haven't had a chance to take that to the stage. So we always try to get new and different and introduce new people to the field. So I agree with you 100% there.
Alejandro, when is that? That's February what through what, and what days are that?
February 18th to the 22nd. It's a Wednesday through a Sunday, so it's actually the longest conference, the largest, and probably the best, most affordable as well. So,
and that's out by Phoenix, but not actually Phoenix.
Correct. Just outside of Phoenix in the fancy Scottsdale area. So it's a beautiful location, a great resort in the desert, and weather's always perfect during that time of year here in Arizona.
Yeah, and I could sure use a break. And you know what? Because I'm in New England, of course. I'm gonna put this out there right now. Is I would love to come out there and broadcast a live show right from there during the conference. And I'm going to put that out there as a goal.
I would love for you to do that. That's been one of my goals, to get you out there, and I think I've said that on a show before, too.
Yeah. Well, I'm planting the seed to see if this can really happen. So what's going on with UFO news this week?
Lots of news. You know, the biggest story we've got thousands and thousands of hits on this story. There's no picture or video with this one, but it is about 10 coal miners in West Virginia who saw what they say they believe to be about 3 large triangular aircraft near them one night. It was about 10 p.m. on October 12th. This is a MUFON story written by Roger Marsh, who is the MUFON Director of Communications and writes daily about MUFON sightings. But, yeah, a lot of people who had seen it. There were no pictures taken, unfortunately, but they believe these things to be large craft. And, you know, a lot of people are disappointed that there weren't pictures taken, but it's difficult to take pictures of lights at night. And supposedly some people have said, you know, coal miners can't take their phones down into the mine, so that's probably why they didn't have their phones with them.
Now, did anyone talk about any noise at all?
No noise. They said they didn't hear any noise.
That's not surprising at all. Now, it kind of makes you wonder if, you know, people talk about the TR-3B. I know I mentioned that a couple of times, that the government has this secret large triangle or any size triangular craft that they figured out anti-gravity. You know, I mean, these are rumors, but still, it almost makes you wonder if the military might be out there with something that we just haven't found out about yet. But
yeah, there could be large dirigibles. I don't believe in the TR-3B. I've done a lot of research. There was a TR-3A, which was a kind of a proof of technology type of thing, but it wasn't anything exotic. I've also spoken with David Marler. I think you have an expert on triangular UFOs, and he feels the same. He hasn't found any evidence that the TR-3B actually exists.
Okay, so I'll never mention that again.
There'd be some people frustrated with that comment, but
yeah,
look
okay,
into it.
That's okay. It's just that's the killer about the internet. There's all kinds of information out there about what these triangles are, and there's repeatedly you see that there. So, what else is going on for the news?
This is a really fun story. This is a humanoid, so some human-looking UFO, and this is really great. I think I've talked about this on your show before. Even though the UK is not investigating UFOs, they have a group like they're part of their FAA called the UK Air Prox Board, and they investigate near misses. So when a commercial airplane and another has a near miss with some other object in the air, they investigate it. Well, these guys said they saw a human, what looked to be like a human flying around, came within a few feet of their plane. The Air Prox Board investigated. They found it wasn't a hang liner. It probably wasn't a balloon due to weather and things like this. So they even said that they're kind of frustrated, but unfortunately they can't say what the heck it was these people might have seen. So this is a really cool, interesting story coming out of the UK.
Did he have a little S on his shirt, maybe? No?
Yeah, people have said it was probably Superman, and that very well may be. But that's still extraterrestrial related because Superman was from
that's
a
true.
planet.
Yeah. There's people speculating that someday we're going to have jetpacks, but I can't see anything up 3,000 feet, that's for sure.
Well, some people have said a wingsuit. These are paragliding kind of things. But there aren't kills and things in the area. At least the experts say the weather wasn't correct for that sort of thing. So they're not sure that was it. They don't think that was at this point.
Well, that's kind of interesting. So what's the last story for this evening?
The last story I want to debunk for your listeners, before it gets too far, there's a rumor that the Swedish military is investigating a USO, like an unidentified submerged object. And they are of sorts, but they do know, or they're convinced it is a Russian submarine. But it is an interesting story in that there have been people spotted some sort of floating object out there, and the Swedish military picked up some communications between the Russian Navy or the Russian area of the naval base and out the ocean out by them. So they're looking for this thing. They think it's a Russian submarine that could be damaged and is having to come up for air, so to speak, occasionally. So it's really interesting. It's a great story because it's the largest operation the Swedish military has undergone outside of the Cold War. But, of course, you know how speculation goes. All of a sudden, it's starting to get out there by some of those people, the usual suspects, that it is extraterrestrial related in some way, but it doesn't appear that is the case.
I'm going with Nessie instead.
Could be.
Hey, well, thank you, Alejandro, and we'll be talking to you next week.
Yeah, thank you. And just to remind people, openminds.tv, they can see all of these stories. But thank you very much, sir.
Yes, and to remind you also, you can look on podcastufo.com, and the links will go over to your site right from there. And so stay tuned after the short music break, and our guests are coming right up. Well, hello, guests. We have Peter Robbins and Robert Salas. How are you both doing, gentlemen?
Hi, Martin. Doing good.
Very well, Martin.
Hey, before we get into anything, I'm just going to say, if you're listening live, please jump over to Podcast UFO, jump in the message board, and we'll try to get your questions to these two gentlemen. So thank you both for coming on. And I want to say, Robert, I've been wanting to get you on, and we talked briefly just a few minutes ago, and and you agreed to come back in December, and we're going to talk about your book. Can you just throw out the title to that quickly and where someone can find it?
Right. It's called Unidentified, the UFO Phenomenon. It's on Amazon. You can get it on Amazon.com. Barnes & Noble also handles it.
Very good. But Peter, welcome back again as well. You were on before, and we seem to run into each other quite a bit. And I didn't mean to offend anyone with the comment I made about the New England conference, but you could hardly notice it was a little sparse.
Yep.
Yeah, just one of those things. Next year, it will be better.
I'm sure.
Yeah. Hey, so Peter, we're really going to be talking mostly about a situation. You've just recently written a book, and it's basically addressing the Rendlesham Forest incident book that recently was written by Nick Pope, who actually wrote for both Peniston and, I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank.
John Burroughs.
John Burroughs, that's right. So what I want to talk about before we get into any of that, I'm just going to throw a question out there to you, and that is why in this particular case, Rendlesham Forest, why is there so much controversy among the people that were involved? In a nutshell, can you describe why do you think that is?
Yeah. First of all, we're talking about an event, a series of events that occurred within a very structured, classified military context.
What do we have going on?
I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
That was my phone.
Is that Men in Black?
I loved it. And from the get-go, unlike a civilian UFO incident as a rule, conscious efforts were made to confuse, obfuse, redirect attention, demean witnesses, drive wedges between witnesses, which is certainly much more doable in a military context rather than a civilian context. I think one of the most telling aspects was, and this is my opinion, that the former deputy base commander of RAF Bentwaters, the base where the men involved were stationed, seems to have gone out of his way over the past few decades to drive an actual wedge between the two first-night witnesses of record and my co-author, Larry Warren, who was involved on the third night. And as I think you're aware, those efforts kind of began to fall apart rather dramatically less than 2 months ago or so, when John Burroughs and Larry Warren established what seems to be the beginning of a really cordial friendship, relationship, colleagueship. And shortly after that, both spoke on the same stage in tandem in Woodbridge, Suffolk, just in August, and are a lot more in agreement now than not agreement. In fact, John seems to have fully estranged himself from his co-authors, and I just think it's fascinating. But that's sort of the longish answer to your short question.
Okay, so why don't we talk about your book and why you wrote it?
Sure. To start with, as many of your listeners know, in 1997, I co-authored a book that was published that year along with Larry Warren again, which went on to become a major bestseller in the United Kingdom. It was republished in an expanded version in 2005. And it's been a case that I researched to the exclusion of pretty much everything else in my life for more than 9 years. And in the intervening 16 or 17 years, I have been as involved in updates and learning what I can about changes in the status of the case and continuing research. So all in all, this is the only event that I've put more than a quarter of a century into looking into in my career in this field. And last year, Gary Hazeltine, who is a British, quite well-known researcher, former police detective, a specialist in forensic evidence, contacted me to find out if the next column that I would be writing for his bi-monthly magazine, that's called UFO Truth Magazine, and I highly encourage listeners to check it out, if I would set aside one of my columns and in its stead review what we knew would be the upcoming book on Rendlesham by Nick Pope, John Burroughs, and Jim Penniston. And in fact, that was published in April. I secured an advance copy of the book in March and began to read it and make my notes. I have to say, I was so unprepared for what I found that I wrote an extremely detailed review, a rather out of contact one. My editor had asked me for 2,500 to 3,500 words, and I gave him 26,000 words. That's extremely unprofessional.
Well, a little overachiever, that's what you're...
It was in no uncertain terms, and I sent it along with a sincere apology and a note saying I would be happy to stay up that night and redact it and pull it into line. And Gary read it and responded to the effect of, this is absolutely crazy over my needs. However, I've read it. It's extremely good. I think that it's a very important review, and I couldn't agree with you more. I will publish it. Don't ever do this again. And so they added about 10 pages to the magazine and published it. Quite honestly, the very next day, I began work on a conference paper, feeling that I really needed to discuss this with people that follow my work, my colleagues, and anyone else interested. And the conference paper grew much too long, and at a certain point I realized I was writing something of a book based very much in a review of another book. The reason this happened, Martin, was because as I read, I was shocked to find data point after data point, all written by Nick Pope, which took information, very specific information, that could not have been found in any other source except for Larry's and my book. The information was then presented in their book called Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, but always in a convoluted manner or an incomplete manner or completely minus the evidence which we had included that backed it up. It was never credited except on, I believe, the two occasions that information that, again, I have to stress here, could have only been taken from Left at East Gate, and in those instances was credited erroneously to other sources.
Peter, can you give a few examples of that?
Sure. Well, let me find a few for you. For starters, on October 28th, 1997, something rather extraordinary happened. A former chief of staff of the Ministry of Defense, in other words, the full equivalent of our Pentagon chief of staff. Bob, what's the term I'm looking for? Colin Powell.
I'm sorry.
Secretary of War? No, what was he?
Powell was Secretary of State, wasn't he?
No, well, yeah, but Chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, right? I mean, that would,
right.
Okay,
Right. Joint Chiefs. Mm-hmm.
Peter Hill Norton was a retired chief of the MOD who had been Admiral of the Fleet before that, highest-ranking British naval officer, who then went on to become a member of Parliament. And while he was in Parliament, we connected with him, shared details of our research. He championed our case. And on, again, 28 December 1997, he went out onto the floor of the House of Lords with his copy of Left at East Gate in hand and working directly out of our book, asked four very challenging questions in person to Lord Gilbert, who was then the Secretary for Defense. One of the questions had to do with something we revealed in our book that was shared with us by former Deputy Base Commander Charles I. Hall, that on the first night of the UFO incursions, and there were 3 of them, 3 nights that is, beams of light were shown into the weapons storage area from these unknowns. And that is the nuclear weapons storage area, I might add. And had anything been done to address this situation? That he had also learned from left at Eastgate of the suicide of one of the men who had been involved, who was incredibly challenged by the information that was given to him in the debriefing, whether it was true or not, and ended up taking his life. He was also my co-author's roommate. Several other questions as well. These questions are brought up in Nick's book by Nick, but again, in a manner that suggests that Larry, first that Peter Hill Norton learned of this information either from part of Colonel Halt's tape recording or from rumors. Neither of those things are true. Lord Hill Norton learned of these things from his reading of Left at East Gate. And because the book, Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, has absolutely no annotations or footnotes, no bibliography, no reading list, an index that is wanting in terms of everything it should have, and only the very modest, most basic appendices, we are compelled to take the author's word for the things that he puts forward. At another point, he discusses, for example, my co-author's allegation that he had observed what we call a cloudbuster, a device that was developed by the scientist Dr. Wilhelm Reich to alter the weather. And they work. I can attest to it. And that Larry's putting forward this allegation was unique, that no one else backed him up, that there were no other witnesses. And in fact, in the same portion of the book, I think it's page 150, 151 of Left at East Gate, we specifically cite 2 other military witnesses who, unprompted, also reported seeing the same device in the same place. Nick's writing, when he does this, is always conciliatory and concerned, as if to suggest, poor Larry Warren, we only have his word for this and we only have his word for that, and with a sense of almost sympathy, which is infuriating in that it seems to be a tactic to leave the reader with a sense that no matter what else I have gotten from my reading of Pope, Penniston, and Burroughs' book, I understand now that there is another witness out there in another book, and I can certainly not have to pay attention to them because, as Mr. Pope says in this book, you know, there are so many questions revolving around that person's account, when in reality there are not.
Yeah. Robert, what's your take in this whole situation?
Yeah, I'd like to mention a couple more things I think Peter might want to expand upon.
Yeah.
And one of them is that Peter has actually gotten some evidence in the form of soil analysis from the location of the craft that came down. In addition, which was not mentioned, of course, in Nick Pope's book. And in addition to that, there was an email, I think, Peter, from John Burroughs to you that had a lot of information that was not mentioned again. I think I would say one of the bottom lines for me is that Nick Pope's book does not give credit to all of the information, the valid information, pertinent information from Left at Eastgate to Peter Robbins and Larry Warren. And I think that brings up other questions which we can go into later.
Yeah, and I will jump in here, Bob. In fact, you're absolutely correct. Although there is no question that we in the research community who have put a certain amount of effort over the years into researching the events in Suffolk of December 1980, and there is evidence, physical evidence, to support the landings of various devices in the area over that 3-night period of time. Certainly, in the case of the 2 first-night witnesses, the very best concentration of evidence above all other evidence that has come in over almost 3.5 decades now is specifically associated with the precise location where my co-author has always maintained that his event took place. And it's nothing less than a triangulation of evidence, I think, so powerful that if such things were adjudicated in courts of law, this evidence could establish beyond any reasonable doubt that something truly anomalous and non-standard had taken place, certainly on the 3rd night. To be specific here, and I feel this is time well spent, the couple of minutes I'm about to take. Larry and I have revisited this area repeatedly over the past quarter century. And most recently, he was back there in August. I was back there in September. We were both back there in February. And the very first time that the two of us walked out to the farmer's field through the forest where this had happened, it was already 8 years and 2 months since the event happened. It was Larry's first time back and my first time there. And at that point, when the forest breaks away and you can see the field, Larry's right arm shot out and he pointed to a specific spot in the field and he said it sat right there. I audio taped this all as it was happening. I didn't want to miss a word, and I knew that it would give me what I needed in terms of the notes that I wasn't taking as such to create a treatment of or quote or put a whole transcript in. And after he says those words, it's quiet for several seconds. And he follows up by saying, but of course, that's just a coincidence that the spot I'm pointing at where the thing sat, it's kind of an oval discoloration. Now, somebody else might jump at that moment and say, wow, a trace case, how cool is that? Because I've trained myself the way that I have over the years, my reaction truly was, yeah, that is a coincidence. Quite a wild one, but there are things to account for. Number one, it's an overcast day. It's a plowed field. It might be a little convex or a little concave. We're looking at it at an angle. Maybe lightning hit it 6 months ago. Maybe somebody dumped a ton of fertilizer on that spot and didn't grade it out all the way. There are reasons. But we kept coming back to the spot, and we could see it look different. And finally, in drawing samples and control samples from the field, just in little film canisters, there was no question that it was different. I returned 1.5 years later, photographed the same spot, and you can now see, this would have been June of 1990, that same oval location is bright green, and all of the foliage around it is hay. It's yellow. Very dramatic picture. I went back yet again 1 year or so later, this time after consulting a laboratory that was going to analyze it with 2-quart very heavy gauge plastic containers to draw samples from the site that had been involved, from the edge of the site, and then control samples from out in the field. And I returned to JFK on that trip with probably close to 20 pounds of dirt carefully labeled in my bag. I don't even want to get into what happened at JFK. That's a story for another time. But I got it through. And the analyst that I was assigned, we ultimately became good friends. I saw him, you might have seen him too, just this past weekend at the New England conference. That's Matthew Moniz. He works for another laboratory now, but he is a highly qualified scientist. And what we learned from that analysis, now more than 20 years old or thereabouts, is this. Number one, that the affected sample's ability to retain moisture, to become mud, is non-existent. The soil either would sink in clumps or float like dust on the surface. It didn't matter how hard either of us worked it, me in a very rudimentary way, him in a sophisticated laboratory setting. We really couldn't get it to reconstitute. Under an electron scanning microscope, the soil that was affected looks different than the control samples in the field. That seed germination tests conducted with the affected sample and control samples show us that in the control samples, everything grows just fine and at the rate of speed that one would expect. In the affected sample, it took much longer to grow, and it was always a mutant strain, his words, of whatever it was that they had seeds for. Hence why the spot itself was just becoming green when everything around it had gone to hay. In the soil in this area, there are like little sand-sized grains of metallic particles. It happens sometimes. Control samples normal. Affected sample more than 4 times the amount of these little metallic samples, from which our analysts could only deduce that an extremely powerful electromagnetic effect had drawn those extra bits of metallic particles into that area, which is quite a feat in itself. Finally, that this all happened only 5 or 6 miles from the coast. So one would expect a fairly realistic component of sand to be part of the soil. It was in the control samples. However, in the affected sample, there was no sand. It was silica. It was an interim form of glass. The sand had melted. Now, you add this impressive list of physical changes to the site that my co-author has always insisted, and years before he marked the same spot on maps for me that he pointed to on that morning. We have an irrefutable series of examples of something anomalous happened on that spot that the authors had said, I think John has now changed his mind, that never happened, or that may have been a hallucination or something put into Larry's head. Nothing could be further from the truth. Superimpose on that the fact that the original audio cassettes that were recorded have been subjected twice over a dozen years to voice stress analysis, both times coming up very respectably in terms of what was concluded. Also, that we know from Larry's original account and from his Air Force Form 490, essentially a report of a medical appointment in the Air Force, that the retinas of his eyes were burned when this flash of light went off when the thing appeared on that spot. Also, that the letter that Larry wrote to his mother 6 or 7 days later is unquestionably the first account that we have anywhere, official or not, of the events in question. Less than a week later, Colonel Halt's document authenticating the event was written, and a few days after that, a response letter from Larry's mother. For me, this overlaying, this triangulation of evidence proves beyond any reasonable doubt that my co-author was deeply involved and that there was a very profound event on the third night, which is completely ignored in this new book, and by implication suggesting that there is nothing to Larry's allegations for the event that he was most certainly involved in.
I want to take a little bit of a shift here, just to ask a question that I think of a lot in this whole case is, and I'd like this opportunity to ask either one of you or Robert. We haven't heard a lot from you. What do you think of? I'm just going to plain out say the Jim Peniston's opinion on downloading binary code, keeping it quiet for I don't know how many, 20 years or something
30.
like that? 30 years.
Yeah.
Allegedly.
And what do you think about his claim of time travel?
Yeah, let me preamble that by stating that John Burroughs is on record now as stating that he never saw any binary code in Peniston's notebook. In addition to that, I've had correspondence with a woman who spent a lot of time with Jim Peniston. I think she was they were close, who stated that Peniston used to write in binary code often, and after that, he went on radio. Peniston did, and stated that he didn't know binary code. The whole binary code thing is pretty flaky to me. I know binary code. I mean, I studied it some time ago. But trying to imagine somebody writing, 9 to 20 pages, I don't remember what he said, of binary code, just ones and zeros, and remembering all that is pretty fantastic.
Now, Robert, you mentioned the very first, you said that John Burroughs did not see this. Now, he actually saw the book, right? The notebook?
I believe he did. I don't know exactly when he saw it, but he claims he never saw any binary code written in that book. This is the book, of course, that Peniston did sketches of some of the symbols on the side of the craft that he saw. Burroughs also stated that he never even saw the craft. You can back me up on that, I think, Peter, right?
Now weren't Burroughs and Peniston together?
Well, they were.
Yeah, they were pretty close. And Burroughs I think he blanked out at one point for a small period of time, but he never saw the craft. He never saw the binary codes. And so, and again, this was not even covered in Nick Pope's book, the fact that there was this disagreement between the two of them on those points.
Yeah, that's correct. And John is on record as saying that the first time Jim even mentioned the code to him, remembering that they were together allegedly when, as Jim has always maintained, or has maintained since he went public with it, that this code was, quote-unquote, downloaded into his head, and that it represented a message from time travelers from our future, quoting Jim, to be revealed to humanity at a later date. John maintains that Jim never even mentioned this to him until October of 2010, almost 30 years after the fact. Nick states he begins his chapter on the code by saying, for 30 years, Jim Peniston kept a secret, and goes on to discuss the allegations. And then shortly after mentions that in 1994, which would have been 14 years after the event, Jim, in fact, does mention the binary code by name in an hypnotic regression. Now, these are not inconsequential inconsistencies. John first went public with this whole code allegation, and I remember it well because I was there at the 30th anniversary conference in Woodbridge, East Anglia, Suffolk, East Anglia, on December 28th, 2010, and said that he would be able to prove his allegation that it was time travelers from our future. The audience, which was a very passionate and very knowledgeable audience, asked him what it was. Jim then said he wished he could tell them, but he was on a non-disclosure contract with History Channel for an upcoming episode, I think, of Ancient Aliens. That episode came and went in 2010 without an answer to the question. It was not answered the following year, and it's certainly not answered in the book. I certainly may be wrong, but I'm convinced that the overwhelming likelihood is that, with all due respect to Jim and what he thinks and believes, he was not, in fact, selected by time travelers to receive a message from the future to share with humanity at a later date. He was, in fact, and continues to be, the victim of a long-term, sophisticated disinformation operation to convince him, obviously successfully, that he was contacted by time travelers. Why would anybody do this? And the reason is really fairly simple. we now live in a day and age where even if you're a skeptic around truly anomalous UFOs and the phenomena as occasionally, advanced technology from parts unknown, but there is a grudging acceptance for it as a possibility in our culture at this point. However, to invoke the very colorful phrase of time travelers from our future, again, I could be wrong, but I think that is going to galvanize a certain amount of ridicule around the seriousness of the case and take attention away from the scientific evidence that has been collected and, give us a shiny object for people to be enamored by and take sides around and do research and spin our collective wheels like crazy and not get anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Can I just chime in on that?
Please.
I think this is the crux of what we're talking about, and that is there a organized disinformation campaign to diminish and ridicule the Rendlesham case? There's a lot of evidence that yes, indeed, there really is, and some of that evidence has to do. I don't think we really mentioned this, but we got to mention the fact that many of these witnesses from Rendlesham were drugged. They were given drugs during their interrogations. I think I've heard of sleep deprivation of some of them, and we had evidence that intelligence agents from both the U.S. And the British were involved in these interrogations to try to confuse the witnesses, put false memories into their minds, and in doing this, the point is that they wanted to make this case so confused and the witnesses so, let's say, unreliable that the case wouldn't be taken seriously. It'd be put in that ridicule category.
Robert, let me ask you this. If this case was hush-hush for, 10 years before Larry finally came out with...
No, I don't think it was 10 years.
How many years was it, Peter?
Larry seeked out a researcher less than 2 years after the event, in 1982. The information that he gave that researcher, Larry Fawcett, who is also a lieutenant in the Coventry, Connecticut Police Department, and only that information, I must stress here, was put into the form of a Freedom of Information Act action, and a few months later resulted in the declassification of Colonel Halt's one-page memo, written as a courtesy to the British Ministry of Defense, on the event. And while it was redacted, minimized the events, shortened the time frame, it's right there on Air Force stationery, and it is a written confirmation, and the only one we had for many years regarding the events in question.
Okay. Well, just a second here. If anyone's listening live on the Dark Matter Radio Network, you can jump over to podcastufo.com. A real easy sign-in for the chat room if you'd like to ask some questions. One of the reasons I asked that, Peter, was why were they getting into all this, the drugging and the debriefing, just out of fear that these servicemen would talk about the situation?
Well, I think that first, as Bob has noted, drugs were definitely used. In fact, one of the more poignant statements in the new book, Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, is Jim saying that he remembers going through at least 14 separate quote-unquote debriefings, and at least 2 of them involving non-Air Force personnel, and a number of them involving injections of something. Now, many people speculate that it was sodium pentothal. I think that's because that drug has been such a staple of movies and spy stories and things for years. But as Bob knows very well, sodium amythol would have been a more likely choice. Sodium pentothal gets people to make it easier working with you that you will tell the truth. Sodium amythol makes you more malleable so that an untruth can be programmed into you to seem true. Why would this happen? Well, I think number one, because this was considered an above top secret situation where leaks of a truly anomalous event happening within a military context against the backdrop of a nuclear treaty violation. We, the United States government, were not supposed to have ordnance in the UK at the time. And as we now know, we certainly did. And it was in Suffolk, and it was a very large amount of nuclear ordnance. I think the main reason was to put the fear of God into these young men and hope that they would just be so intimidated by what they had been told, true and not true. And let's remember that disinformation is, by definition, a skillful blend of fact and fiction to produce a certain result. And I believe the result here was fairly understandable, to make these guys so intimidated that they would simply want to go on with their lives and, not get involved, and certainly not do what Larry Warren did and become a whistleblower on this.
Yes, I want to talk about Larry Warren. There's, you hear sometimes that, well, let me just point out, blank, ask you, did he actually see the craft at any point?
Larry Warren was involved on the third night of events. John and Jim were involved on the first night. Mm-hmm. There's no crossover there. He was not there to see the machine that Jim has described. Larry Warren most certainly did see the craft that appeared on the third night and left all of those physiological changes to the soil and the crop that grow in the soil.
Okay. Now, there was a while there that Charles Halt was saying that he didn't see Larry Warren, or he didn't think Larry Warren was there. Was that ever resolved?
No, he's still doing it. And that is after publicly, to the best of my knowledge, at least twice, saying that he couldn't say whether or not Larry was there that night because they weren't in the same location. And in fact, on another radio show, and I think you know the host very well, he's a friend of both of ours, Paul Eno's show, in the months leading up to the 30th anniversary, that being from, I believe, the spring or summer of 2009 right up until November or even December, Paul really did something extraordinary. He pulled together quite a number of the witnesses, including Halt, Peniston, Burroughs, Warren, quite a number of writers and researchers who had contributed to the story, including myself, Nick, Linda Howe, and others. And in one of those radio broadcasts, and I've written about it, I think it's definitely part of the new book, Hall says, all right, you were there. And if I'm off, it's by a word. But that hasn't stopped him from, since then, saying that he wasn't there, or that he was so messed with that you can't trust what he's saying, or. Charles Halt speaks out of two sides of his mouth.
You know, I saw him speak down in North Carolina a year ago, last June, and he's very well spoken.
Oh yes,
and he also seems like a man of true integrity. But you're saying that you hear different things.
Well, all I can say is anybody that has a question about this, please read my new book. It's called Deliberate Deception, A Case of Disinformation in the UFO Research Community. I hope you will also read Nick, Jim, and John's book, Encounter in the Rendlesham Forest. However, you can read my book at no cost, because I felt in responding to their book that the charges I was making were serious enough, and that I did not want anybody even suggesting that I had written a response because I felt that I wasn't getting enough attention or to make money, that I decided to give this somewhere between 600 and 700 hours of dedicated work away for free, as well as the largest Rendlesham-related database ever made public. The book comes in at 450 pages. Read it for yourself and decide whether or not you feel Charles Halt is a man of integrity.
Can I make a couple of points on Colonel Halt?
Yeah, sure. But before you do, I just want to say, Peter, no wonder your publisher doesn't like you. But
My publisher?
Your publisher was angry that you published this book. Now I know why. It's free.
No. My publisher likes me fine. This book was never intended to make money, and the publisher that did publish it, that is Steve Mira in the UK, who is the managing editor of a terrific monthly magazine called Phenomena Magazine, publishes that magazine for free, so I approached the right person.
Yes. All right, Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, a couple of points on Colonel Halt. The one thing that concerns me is Halt has never stated that he was interrogated. We do know that they had all these witnesses were interrogated, and Colonel Halt was one of the primary witnesses because, we've got it on tape recording of him seeing these strange lights in the sky. And yet, we know some of these other witnesses, many of them were drugged and suffered through, let's say, extreme kinds of interrogation. And Halt has never stated that he was interrogated by any of them. The other point with Colonel Halt is, again, he keeps waffling about whether Larry Warren was there. However, let's see. Yeah, there's plenty of support that Larry Warren was there on the third night. In fact, I think the first interview that Larry gave with Mr. Fawcett was with Adrian Bustinza, who's another witness that, again, verified that Larry Warren was there. At any rate, and Halt has also said many times, I think, Peter, you can back me up on this, that there is more to this story that he knows, and he's withholding some information from the public on it. He said this many times. He's told me that personally. And so why hasn't he come forward with everything he knows?
I would interject something. I wasn't going to say anything, but I do want to say this. And, I may get a little backlash for it, but I spoke with Halt last year, and he indeed did tell me that he was drugged and interrogated.
Wow.
And I don't know what anyone's going to think about that, but he actually told me this, and there was one other person standing with us. And I had thought that was the first time I'd ever heard it, and I've been doing some research on it, and nobody has mentioned that before.
Thank you for mentioning that for the reasons that you've just said. It is never easy or enjoyable to put something like that on the record. And I have to say the process of writing this book and the months that I spent on it were very unsatisfying and very... I could have been doing so many other things that I would have preferred to do. But sometimes you simply have to address a situation. Gary Hasseltine, who we've discussed, a British researcher, he worked fairly closely with Halt for a while, and he told me that Halt specifically told him that following the incident he had been involved in, the very famous one where the UFO shined the light right down to where he and the men he was with were, all of which was recorded, and that part of that recording become a staple of various documentaries, that they then moved out into the farmer's field known as Capel Green and around a landmark stand of trees that would have brought them back around and in absolute gun-sight clarity to where Larry Warren and the men he was with were at that time, or so we've been able to deduce. And when Gary asked Charles what he saw when they got to that point, and I am as sure as I can be that this is a quote, Halt told Hasseltine, "That's the funny thing, I don't remember." And I have no doubt that he's telling the truth. but missing time, manipulation of a number of sorts seem to thread their way straight through this. Charles Halt, for me, continues to be the most complex individual and the highest-ranking one.
I'm terribly sorry.
That's okay.
That was totally my fault.
Not a problem. The most complex individual to be involved in actually down in the trenches on this thing, namely because he is both a witness and someone who has fused a certain amount of clarity in this. I think it's laudatory that he is on record repeatedly as saying things like, what my men and I saw that night was not built by any government on this planet. And certainly that is a courageous statement for any retired military officer to make. Then at the same time, working with and against witnesses to drive a wedge between them. And as we see in deliberate deception, ultimately doing the same thing that he did for decades to Larry Warren, to John Burroughs, and then to Jim Penniston. And then for whatever reasons, Jim is able to reconcile this, the two of them now working together again, and John Burroughs very much in line with Larry in his thinking now, and completely untrusting of his former deputy base commander. And he also feels that his friend making this claim with other inconsistencies, that being Jim Penniston.
Peter, I hate to do this to you, but we're out of time.
Well, how about that?
But we're going to have to go, though, for now. That's it for the show. You can check out links to the show notes on Podcast UFO. I want to thank everyone that helped out with the show today. Keith Rowland for the Dark Matter Radio Network. We have Peggy Shunning, who helps out on the Facebook page. We'll see you next week.